This is our second video on quadratic inequalities, and let's find the region where x squared minus x plus 4 is less than or equal to 6. Now if at any point you want to pause the video and work this question on your own, feel free to do so. Then you can press play and check your work, or you can move to the end of the video just to check your answer. Alright, well the first step we want to do is subtract this 6 from both sides. So we'll get a new expression, a new quadratic function. X squared minus x minus 2 is now less than or equal to 0. And why did we want to do that? Well, you cannot factor a quadratic expression if it's equal to anything other than 0. If you factored this top expression, you would get an incorrect answer or a misleading answer. You only want to factor a quadratic expression if it's equal to or less than or equal to or less than the number 0. Alright, now I claim that this is a reasonable thing to do because the region where our second function is less than or equal to 0 is exactly the same as the region where our first function is less than or equal to 6. And just to make that really clear, I thought I'd show you visually with an applet. So here we see our blue function is that original function x squared minus x plus 4, and this red line has a height of 6. So we're looking for the region where our blue function is below that red line. And in order to do that, what we can do is we can subtract 6 from both sides, and that just moves each side straight down until you're looking at our new function, which is now less than or equal to 0. And as you can see, the region where our new function is less than or equal to 0 is exactly the same as the region where our old function is less than or equal to 6. Alright, so let's return to the question. And again, feel free to jump in and work from any point on. So the next step is to factor the left-hand side, and this function factors as x plus 1 times x minus 2, which again we want to be less than or equal to 0. Alright, now at this point we'll use the same techniques we developed in the previous quadratic inequalities video. Namely, I'm going to take a number line and mark off the two zeros of my new function, and then we'll test points to see whether the function is positive or negative. So this first factor gives me a 0 located at negative 1. And the second factor gives me a 0 located at positive 2. And now we can just test a point to the left of negative 1, between negative 1 and 2, and to the right of 2. So let's start by testing the point negative 2. Okay, so using the factored form, I have negative 2 plus 1. Let's write that again. Negative 2 plus 1 times negative 2 minus 2. Now this first factor is negative, and the second factor is negative, and so a negative number times a negative number gives me a positive function value. Alright, that means everywhere in this region my quadratic function is positive, because quadratic functions are continuous, and as we discussed in our last video, if you're positive at any point between zeros on a continuous function, you must be positive everywhere. Alright, so now let's look at a point in between these two. Let's look at the point 0. So we have 0 plus 1 times 0 minus 2. Well, that's a positive number times a negative number, and so we get a negative function value. And that means everywhere in here, my function must be negative, less than or equal to 0. And finally, let's test a point to the right of positive 2. Let's test the point 3. So we have 3 plus 1 times 3 minus 2, which are both positive numbers. So when you multiply them together, you get a positive function value. And so our quadratic function is positive everywhere to the right of 2. Okay, so now we're able to answer our question, and so we kind of work backwards. So our function, our second function, x squared minus x minus 2, is less than or equal to 0. whenever x is in the region -1 up to 2. And here I use square brackets because it's equal to 0 at -1 and it's equal to 0 at 2. So I want to make sure and I include those endpoints. Well, as I said, x squared minus x minus 2 is less than or equal to 0, exactly where x squared minus x plus 4 is less than or equal to 6. And so now we really are answering that original question. X squared minus x plus 4 is less than or equal to 6 whenever x is in the region -1 up to 2. And there is our answer. Okay, now I just want to say one quick note about this method that I used over here. Now, when I introduced this method in the previous video and when I used it here, you might have thought to yourself, well, this looks a lot like guess and check. Now remember that my math teacher told me that guess and check is not a very good way to do mathematics. It's not rigorous, you might make false conclusions, it's somewhat dangerous as an approach. And I might agree with that in general, but I would say that this method is not really guessing and checking. To me, this is a method that takes advantage of the structure of these functions, the structure of quadratic functions and of continuous functions in general. If we always know that continuous functions have this useful property, then we can cut down on a lot of work by taking advantage of that property. So as you learn mathematics and as we study these new functions, always be on the lookout for the structure of the functions that we're looking at. Because recognizing and using structure is one of the central ideas of doing algebra in particular. Alright, thanks a lot for watching. I hope this was helpful.